What makes a sci-fi movie from the 1980s still shine decades later? Is it the effects, the story, or that strange mix of grit and imagination that only that era could deliver? The truth is, the 80s gave us some of the boldest leaps in the genre, from neon-soaked fantasies to bleak dystopias. And here's the kicker. Many of them feel sharper than ever. So, buckle up because we're diving into 10 retro gems that prove timelessness is real. The Thing, 1982. This wasn't just a horror film in the snow, it was a study in fear, trust, and the limits of humanity. John Carpenter's The Thing landed in the summer of 1982. The same season audiences were swooning over the heartwarming glow of E.T. Instead of warmth, Carpenter gave us ice-cold terror. A group of American researchers in Antarctica discover an alien parasite that can imitate any living organism. Suddenly, every glance becomes suspicious, every shadow a possible threat. The story unfolds not just as a creature feature, but as a relentless spiral into paranoia. What set The Thing apart wasn't only its premise, it was the execution. Rob Bottin's groundbreaking practical effects were grotesque, inventive, and decades ahead of their time. From spider-like heads to writhing transformations, these weren't just effects. They were nightmares come alive. And unlike the clean lines of digital graphics, these tactile creations still hold up because they feel disturbingly real. Critics in the 80s hated it. Many called it excessive or too bleak, and the movie bombed at the box office. But here's the twist. Time was on Carpenter's side. VHS rentals and midnight screenings turned it into a cult classic, and now it's hailed as one of the greatest sci-fi horrors ever made. The brilliance of The Thing is its refusal to offer comfort. There's no clear hero, no tidy resolution, just an ending as frozen and ambiguous as the Antarctic itself. Watching it today, you realize it's more than a monster movie. It's a reflection of Cold War paranoia, of human distrust, of survival at any cost. And that's why it endures, because fear, suspicion, and the unknown never go out of style. Tron, 1982. Long before digital worlds became everyday reality, one film dared to imagine life inside a computer. Disney's Tron, released in 1982, wasn't just a movie. It was a visual experiment, unlike anything Hollywood had attempted. At the time, the concept of computer graphics was more science lab curiosity than mainstream entertainment. Yet, here was a film that transported audiences into a neon-lit grid where programs were warriors and data was the new battlefield. The plot followed Kevin Flynn, a software engineer sucked into a digital mainframe where he must battle programs and escape the grip of an oppressive system. On the surface, it was a fantasy adventure, but beneath it, Tron was hinting at the rise of a world shaped by computers, long before the internet or gaming culture exploded. What made Tron unforgettable wasn't its dialogue, or even its story. It was its look. The glowing suits, the iconic light cycles, the stark geometries of its digital arenas, these images were unlike anything else on screen in the early 80s. Critics were divided, calling it both dazzling and hollow, but the visuals carved their place in pop culture. Over time, Tron's influence became undeniable. It inspired generations of game designers, animators, and filmmakers who grew up mesmerized by its boldness. Without Tron, the evolution of virtual reality, digital animation, and even blockbuster franchises like The Matrix might look very different. Rewatching Tron today, you feel its charm not in polished perfection, but in its daring experimentation. It carries the retro, futuristic vibe of a world still figuring out technology's power, and that makes it both nostalgic and eerily relevant. The movie wasn't ahead of its time. It was from another time entirely, a place where imagination ran faster than computers, and that's why it still glows bright, even decades later. The Terminator, 1984. This wasn't just a robot story, it was a relentless nightmare with a ticking clock. When James Cameron unleashed the Terminator in 1984, audiences weren't prepared for what hit them. This wasn't a glossy blockbuster with shiny gadgets and futuristic optimism. It was raw, low budget, and utterly terrifying. At its core was a chilling concept, an unstoppable machine sent from the future to wipe out the mother of humanity's savior before he was even born. Arnold Schwarzenegger's role as the Terminator was career-defining. With his towering frame, blank expression, and minimal dialogue, he wasn't just playing a character, he was embodying fear itself. Every movement, every line, every shadow he stepped into was pure menace. And that was the genius of it. You couldn't reason with him. You couldn't bargain. You could only run. But here's the secret sauce. The movie wasn't only about the machine. It was about Sarah Connor, played by Linda Hamilton. She began as an ordinary waitress, a regular woman suddenly thrust into chaos. Watching her evolve from confused victim to determined survivor gave the story its heart. In many ways, Sarah's transformation mirrored the audience's own realization. Humanity isn't weak. It adapts. It fights back. Despite its modest budget, Cameron stretched every dollar. The film's gritty look, practical effects, and inventive action sequences gave it a rough-edged realism that still feels fresh. The police station showdown, the chase through the streets of Los Angeles, the factory climax, each scene stacked tension higher and higher. At the box office, The Terminator was a surprise hit. It didn't just succeed, it cemented the 80s as the decade of sci-fi thrillers that blurred the line between action and horror. Today, while technology has changed and effects are sleeker, the raw urgency of The Terminator hasn't dulled. It remains a film about survival, destiny, and what happens when the future tries to erase the present. That's why, even decades later, the chase hasn't ended. RoboCop, 1987. On the surface, it looked like another action flick. In reality, it was razor-sharp satire wrapped in armor. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop, released in 1987, did something few sci-fi films dared. It made audiences laugh, wince, and think sometimes all in the same scene. Set in a crumbling Detroit, dominated by corporate greed, the story follows Alex Murphy, a police officer brutally injured and reborn as a half-human, half-machine enforcer. The twist? He wasn't built to protect people, he was built to serve a company. At first glance, RoboCop delivered everything 80s audiences craved. Explosive action, futuristic tech, and a larger-than-life hero. But Verhoeven layered it with biting social commentary. The over-the-top commercials sprinkled throughout the movie mocked consumerism. The depiction of corporations running cities felt outrageous then, yet eerily prophetic now. It was campy, yes, but underneath the satire was a mirror pointed straight at society. What made RoboCop endure wasn't only the critique, it was Murphy's story. Stripped of his humanity, haunted by fragments of memory, and struggling to reclaim his identity, Murphy became more than just a cyborg. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that humanity can't be erased by programming. His journey from machine to man gave the film emotional weight to balance the spectacle. The effects, too, were unforgettable. The bulky design of RoboCop's suit, the menacing ED-29 droid, and the practical effects made the world feel tactile. And then there was the tone. Gleefully violent one moment, unexpectedly tender the next. Few films could pull off that balancing act, but RoboCop managed it with style. Over time, the film grew into a cult classic. Sequels and remakes came and went, but none captured the raw energy of Verhoeven's original. Watching it today, you realize it wasn't just a product of the 80s. It was a warning, dressed as entertainment, a future that felt absurd then, but feels unsettlingly familiar now. And that's why it still hits hard decades later. E.T. the Extraterrestrial, 1982. This wasn't just about an alien, it was about childhood, wonder, and saying goodbye. When Steven Spielberg released E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982, audiences expected another sci-fi adventure. What they got was something far more intimate, a story that blended outer space fantasy with everyday suburban life. Instead of distant galaxies or high-tech battles, Spielberg set his tale in backyards, kitchens, and bedrooms, making the extraordinary feel achingly personal. At its heart, E.T. is about the friendship between a lonely boy, Elliot, and an alien stranded on Earth. The film captured the innocence of childhood, the thrill of sneaking secrets past adults, the unshakable belief in magic, and the heartbreak of growing up. Elliot and E.T. weren't just boy and alien. They were mirrors of each other, lost, longing, and desperately in need of connection. The imagery became legendary. The flying bicycle silhouetted against the moon, E.T.'s glowing finger, the heartwarming final farewell. These weren't just cinematic moments, they became cultural symbols of the 80s. John Williams' soaring score added a timeless sweep, amplifying every beat of wonder and sorrow. What made E.T. endure wasn't flashy effects, though the animatronics for the alien were groundbreaking. It was the emotional honesty. Spielberg tapped into universal themes of friendship, loss, and the fear of being misunderstood. Watching it today, you don't just see an alien, you feel the ache of saying goodbye to childhood itself. The movie was a box office juggernaut, dethroning Star Wars as the highest-grossing film at the time. Yet, beyond the numbers, it left a permanent mark on audiences. Decades later, children still watch it wide-eyed, and adults still tear up at the farewell. E.T. isn't just a retro sci-fi, it's proof that the most powerful stories aren't about other worlds. They're about our own hearts. Aliens, 1986. Sometimes a sequel doesn't just continue the story, it redefines it. James Cameron's Aliens hit theaters in 1986, and it didn't just build on Ridley Scott's original masterpiece, it exploded it into a new genre. Where Alien was slow-burn horror, Aliens was high-octane survival. A full-throttle roller coaster that somehow deepened the story, while cranking the adrenaline to 11. Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley returned, no longer just a survivor, but a warrior. Haunted by her trauma, yet unwilling to bow to fear, Ripley cemented herself as one of cinema's greatest heroes. Her bond with Newt, the young girl she protects, brought emotional depth to the chaos. Ripley wasn't just fighting monsters, she was fighting for family, for humanity, for survival itself. The action set pieces were legendary. The face-off with the Alien Queen, the claustrophobic firefights in dim corridors, the iconic line, "Get away from her, you," followed by Ripley in a towering power loader. Every sequence blended tension with spectacle, keeping audiences glued to the screen. Yet Cameron's brilliance wasn't just in the thrills. The film was layered with commentary about corporate greed, military overconfidence, and the cost of dehumanizing others. Beneath the explosions, Aliens was as much about motherhood, trauma, and resilience as it was about extraterrestrial threats. At the time, sequels were often dismissed as cash grabs, but Aliens shattered that notion, proving a follow-up could be just as impactful, maybe even more. Critics raved, audiences roared, and Weaver's performance earned her an Academy Award nomination, a rare feat for a sci-fi action film. Rewatching Aliens today, it's as thrilling as ever. The pacing, the performances, the blend of fear and determination, they haven't aged a bit. If anything, the film feels like a blueprint for how modern blockbusters should balance spectacle with heart, and that's why it holds up, because it reminds us that sequels can soar, not stumble. They live. 1988. It looked like campy pulp, but it spoke louder than almost any sci-fi of its era. John Carpenter's They Live arrived in 1988. Armed with a wrestler-turned-actor, oversized sunglasses, and one of the strangest premises in sci-fi. On paper, it sounded almost ridiculous. A drifter discovers special glasses that reveal the world is secretly controlled by aliens disguised as humans. Billboards scream, "Obey." Money reads, "This is your God." Authority is nothing but manipulation. But here's the genius. What sounded silly was actually razor-sharp commentary on society. Beneath the wrestling moves and campy dialogue, Carpenter was pointing a finger at consumerism, conformity, and hidden power. The aliens weren't just villains, they were metaphors for everything that quietly steers human behavior. And that's why the movie hit nerves then and still resonates now. The star, Rowdy Roddy Piper, wasn't a trained actor, but his raw presence worked perfectly. His famous line about chewing bubblegum and kicking butt has echoed through pop culture for decades. The fight scene between Piper and Keith David, dragging on for nearly 6 minutes, became one of the most iconic and absurd brawls ever filmed. At release, critics were puzzled. Was it satire? Was it action? Was it comedy? The answer was yes, They Live was all of the above, mashed into a B-movie package with an A-grade brain. Audiences slowly caught on, and it blossomed into a cult favorite. Watching it today, you realize Carpenter wasn't making predictions. He was holding up a mirror. The idea that hidden forces shape our choices feels less like fantasy and more like a warning. Sure, the effects are dated, and the style screams 80s. But the message? That's timeless. They Live is proof that sometimes the strangest movies end up speaking the loudest truths. The Fly, 1986. A love story turned inside out literally. David Cronenberg's The Fly, released in 1986, was a remake that redefined what a remake could be. The original from the late 50s was a pulpy sci-fi tale, but Cronenberg injected it with body horror, romance, and tragedy, creating a film that was equal parts grotesque and heartbreaking. The story follows Seth Brundle, a brilliant yet eccentric scientist who builds a teleportation device. In a moment of overconfidence, he tests it on himself, unaware that a housefly has slipped inside the machine. At first, the transformation seems like a gift. Brundle gains strength, speed, and heightened abilities. But then, the dark twist sets in. His body begins to deteriorate, merging grotesquely with the insect's DNA. What starts as scientific triumph spirals into a living nightmare. Jeff Goldblum's performance was mesmerizing. He captured Brundle's awkward charm, his initial excitement, and later, his horrifying descent into decay. Opposite him, Geena Davis brought warmth and emotional grounding as the journalist who loved him. Their relationship gave the movie its heart, making the horror even more gut-punching. This wasn't just about a man turning into a creature, it was about love collapsing under the weight of tragedy. Cronenberg's practical effects were legendary. The makeup transformations were so visceral they remain shocking today, decades later. But beneath the grotesque imagery, The Fly was about something deeply human: fear of disease, loss, and the fragility of our bodies. It took a sci-fi premise and anchored it in universal anxieties, making it unforgettable. At the box office, the film was a hit, and critics praised its mix of horror and emotional depth. Today, The Fly stands tall as not only a landmark of sci-fi horror, but also one of the most tragic love stories ever filmed. It still crawls under your skin because it's not just about monsters. It's about watching someone you love disappear. Akira, 1988. Animation that shattered boundaries and still feels futuristic. When Akira burst out of Japan in 1988, Western audiences didn't quite know what to make of it. This wasn't the Saturday morning cartoon style they were used to. This was something darker, louder, and breathtakingly bold. Directed by Katsuhiro Otomo, Akira wasn't just an animated movie, it was a full-blown revolution in storytelling and visuals. Set in Neo-Tokyo, a city rebuilt after devastation, the film follows Kaneda, a biker gang leader, and his childhood friend Tetsuo, who gains uncontrollable psychic powers. What begins as a street-level tale of rebellion spirals into an apocalyptic struggle over humanity's future. The scale was staggering, from neon-lit cityscapes to explosive psychic battles that shattered entire buildings. Every frame screamed ambition. The animation was groundbreaking. Hand-drawn with meticulous detail, it showcased motion and lighting effects rarely seen in the medium. Even today, Akira's visuals rival modern digital animation. The motorcycle chase with Kaneda's red bike remains one of the most iconic sequences in anime history, endlessly referenced in pop culture. But Akira wasn't just style, it was substance. It tackled themes of power, corruption, government control, and the fragility of human identity. Beneath the explosions and psychic showdowns was a warning about society's obsession with control and the chaos of unchecked growth. It was philosophical without being pretentious, thrilling without losing its message. Though it initially confused Western audiences, Akira paved the way for anime's global boom. Without it, films like The Matrix or shows like Stranger Things wouldn't look the same. Its influence seeps into nearly every sci-fi creation that came after. Rewatching Akira today, it still feels ahead of its time. The dystopian setting, the questions it asks, the way it pushes animation to its limits, it's as fresh and haunting as it was in the late 80s. Few films animated or not have aged this well. The Last Starfighter, 1984. In the summer of 1984, The Last Starfighter hit theaters and tapped directly into the arcade craze sweeping across America. The premise was every gamer's dream. Alex Rogan, a small-town teenager stuck in a dead-end life, discovers that the arcade game he mastered is actually a secret test. His skills don't just win him bragging rights, they make him the perfect candidate to fight in a real intergalactic war. Unlike the gritty dystopias of other 80s sci-fi films, The Last Starfighter carried a sense of optimism. It wasn't about the collapse of society or paranoia about the future, it was about the fantasy of escaping into something bigger. For every kid who spent hours feeding quarters into arcade machines, this was wish fulfillment at its finest. What made it groundbreaking wasn't only the story, but the technology. The Last Starfighter was one of the first films to use extensive computer-generated imagery for its space battles. While the graphics may look retro today, they were cutting edge in the mid-80s, laying the groundwork for the digital effects that dominate modern cinema. Lance Guest as Alex brought just the right mix of wide-eyed innocence and reluctant heroism. The film leaned into the joy of discovery, pairing dazzling space battles with heartfelt moments of family and self-discovery. And Robert Preston's turn as the charming alien recruiter Centauri gave the movie a whimsical spark. Though it wasn't a massive box office smash, The Last Starfighter grew into a beloved cult classic. It captured the spirit of its time, the belief that anyone, even a small-town dreamer, could rise to greatness. Decades later, it still resonates because it blends nostalgia with timeless themes of courage, hope, and the idea that games can change lives. It's not just retro sci-fi, it's the ultimate underdog fantasy, so there you have it. 10 retro sci-fi films from the 1980s that refuse to fade. Some were dismissed when they first hit theaters, others became instant blockbusters, but all of them still pack the same punch today. Which of these do you think holds up the best, or did we miss one of your favorites? Let us know in the comments, share this with a fellow movie fan, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden gems from cinema's wild past.